The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. stood like a monument to justice, its marble columns gleaming in the morning sun. Jayden Carter walked through the security checkpoint, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the polished floor. At 25, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every opportunity through sheer intellect and determination. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, a graduation gift from his mother, who had worked double shifts at Atlanta General Hospital to support his dreams. The briefcase in his hand contained months of meticulous research. The case seemed straightforward on paper, but Jayden knew better. Nothing was ever straightforward when you looked like him in rooms like this. Marcus Williams sat in the defendant's chair, 17 years old and trying to appear invisible. The charges against him were serious, vandalizing a federal building and resisting arrest. The prosecution painted him as another statistic, another young black man who couldn't stay out of trouble. But Jayden had spent weeks digging into the details, and what he'd found would change everything. Judge Harold Brennan entered the courtroom with the authority of 23 years on the federal bench. Silver-haired and sharp-eyed, he had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and zero tolerance for what he called modern legal theatrics. His gaze swept the room before settling on Jayden with thinly veiled skepticism. "Your Honor," Jayden began, his voice carrying the warm cadence of his Atlanta upbringing. "We gather here today not simply to determine guilt or innocence, but to examine the very foundation of how justice is administered in our—" The gavel's sharp crack cut through his words like a blade. "Counselor Carter, I presume?" Judge Brennan's tone carried an edge that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Yes, Your Honor." Jayden Carter, representing the defendant. The judge leaned forward, studying Jayden like a specimen under a microscope. "Tell me, did Harvard Law School stop teaching proper diction? Or did they simply lower their admission standards to accommodate diverse perspectives?" The words hung in the air like smoke. The court reporter's fingers paused over her stenotype machine. Spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus's mother, Dorothy Williams, gripped her purse tighter, her knuckles going white. Jayden felt a familiar burn of humiliation creep up his neck, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times at Harvard when professors questioned his preparedness or classmates whispered about affirmative action admissions behind his back. But his expression remained perfectly composed, a skill he'd mastered through years of navigating spaces that weren't designed for him. "I graduated summa cum laude, Your Honor. Top 5% of my class." "Could have fooled me," the judge replied with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Please continue, but do try to enunciate clearly. This is a federal courtroom, not a local establishment." The implied insult landed like a physical blow. Jayden's hands tightened imperceptibly around his briefcase handle, but his voice remained steady. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't want there to be any misunderstanding." District Attorney Rebecca Hartwell rose from the prosecution table, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her sharp suit and sharper smile. At 43, she had built her career on high-profile convictions and had never lost a case involving what she privately called urban defendants. "Your Honor," she interjected with practiced smoothness, "perhaps we could proceed with opening statements? I'm sure this young man will find his rhythm eventually." She emphasized young man with the same tone one might use to describe a misbehaving child. The condescension was deliberate, calculated to undermine Jayden's credibility before he'd even begun his defense. Judge Brennan chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Indeed, Mr. Carter, please continue your opening statement. And do speak up. We can barely understand you with that accent of yours." The gallery erupted in uncomfortable murmurs and barely suppressed laughter. Jayden could feel Marcus sinking deeper into his chair, shame radiating from the teenager's hunched shoulders. In the front row, Marcus's mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her faith in the system crumbling with each passing moment. But Jayden smiled. It was a subtle expression, one that would have been invisible to most observers, but it carried the weight of every slight he'd endured, every assumption that had been made about his intelligence, every door that had been closed in his face, because they had no idea what was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began again, this time allowing his southern drawl to flow more freely, each word carrying the musical rhythm of his homeland. "Today y'all gone witness something special. You gone see what happens when the truth meets the light." Judge Brennan's eyes rolled, so dramatically that several jurors noticed. "Counselor, I must insist that you maintain proper courtroom decorum. This is not a revival meeting." "Yes, sir, Your Honor. I'll be sure to keep it real proper for y'all." More snickers from the gallery. D.A. Hartwell whispered something to her assistant, loud enough for the jury to hear. This should be entertaining. Jayden opened his briefcase with deliberate precision, each movement calculated and controlled. Inside lay the fruits of sleepless nights spent in Harvard's law library, cross-referencing case precedents, analyzing police reports for inconsistencies, and building a defense that would shatter every assumption in this room. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, they gone try to make you small. But remember, a diamond don't lose its shine just 'cause somebody can't see its value." The old man had raised him after his father left, teaching him Latin from a worn Bible, while his mother worked her nursing shifts. "Veritas vos liberbit," he would say. "The truth will set you free. But first, you gotta know what truth sounds like in every language." "Now, as I was saying," Jayden continued, his accent now deliberately thicker, "we here today 'cause somebody decided my client looked guilty before they even bothered to look at the facts. But facts don't lie, and neither does the law, no matter how you pronounce it." He paused, letting his words sink in while he studied the faces of the jurors. Some looked embarrassed by the judge's behavior. Others seemed curious about where this unusual opening was heading. All of them were paying attention now. Marcus Williams stands accused of crimes he couldn't have committed at a time he wasn't even present, with evidence that don't exist. And I'm going to prove every word of that statement before we're done here today. Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Daniel Murphy to the stand. A thick-set man in his mid-40s approached the witness box with the swagger of someone who had testified in hundreds of cases. Murphy had 20 years with the Metropolitan Police Department and a reputation for what he called proactive community policing in Washington's rougher neighborhoods. "Officer Murphy," Jayden began, his drawl slow and deliberate, "you were the arresting officer in this case. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir, that's right." "And according to your report, you observed my client spray painting the federal building at approximately 9:47 p.m. on March 15th? "That's correct." "Caught him red-handed with the spray, in his possession." Judge Brennan interrupted with an exaggerated sigh. "Counselor Carter, could you please speak at a normal pace? We don't have all day to accommodate your leisurely speaking style." Several jurors frowned at the judge's comment. Jayden noticed their discomfort and filed it away for later use. "Of course, Your Honor. Just want to make sure every word is crystal clear." He turned back to Murphy. "Now, officer, you said you caught my client red-handed. That's an interesting choice of words. Tell me, was there any paint found on Marcus Williams' hands when you arrested him?" Murphy shifted slightly in his seat. "Well, no, but he could have wiped them clean." "Could have. But you didn't test for paint residue, did you?" "We didn't think it was necessary at the time." "You didn't think it was necessary to test for physical evidence of the crime you were charging him with?" D.A. Hartwell jumped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor." Argumentative. "Sustained." Judge Brennan ruled quickly. "Counselor, stick to the facts." Jayden nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor." "Officer Murphy, let me ask you this. Cogitare ante agere. Do you know what that means?" The officer looked confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "Asterisk cogitare ante agere asterisk," Jayden repeated, his pronunciation perfect. "It's Latin. It means think before you act." Judge Brennan's eyebrows shot up, his smirk returning with renewed vigor. "Counselor, are you seriously attempting to impress this court with your limited grasp of classical languages?" The condescension in his voice was palpable. "You don't even sound like you understand what you just said." The courtroom held its collective breath. This was the moment of truth, the point where Jayden would either crumble under the pressure or rise to meet it. D.A. Hartwell leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile, confident that the young lawyer had just walked into a trap of his own making. Jayden straightened his shoulders, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality entirely. Not the honey-smooth drawl of the South, but a precise, crisp articulation of someone who had mastered the language of power. Asterisk reus, an exception-fit actor. Incumbent probatio cadicit, non conegit. Onus probandi incumbent ei cadicit, non ei conegit. In jubeo, pro reo, asterisk. The Latin flowed from his tongue like water, each word perfectly pronounced, each phrase building upon the last with devastating precision. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that the entire courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Brennan's smirk evaporated entirely. His face went pale, then flushed red as the implications of what he was hearing sank in. But Jayden wasn't finished. He continued with even greater authority. Asterisk audi alterum partem. Nemo judex in causa sua. Ignorantia juris non excusat. Nullum crimen sine leg. Nulla pena sine leg. Asterisk. The jury sat transfixed. Several members leaned forward in their seats, completely absorbed by this unexpected display of erudition. D.A. Hartwell's mouth had fallen open in shock. Officer Murphy looked like he wished he could disappear. "Allow me to translate for court," Jayden said, his voice now perfectly neutral, every trace of his accent controlled and modulated. "The defendant becomes a plaintiff in pleading an exception. The burden of proof lies with he who affirms, not he who denies. The burden of proof lies on him who declares, not on him who denies. When in doubt, favor the defendant." He paused, letting the first set of translations sink in before continuing. "Hear the other side. No one should be a judge in his own case. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. No crime without law, no punishment without law." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Brennan stared at Jayden as if seeing him for the first time, his assumptions crumbling in real time. Jayden allowed his southern accent to return gradually, like putting on a comfortable jacket. "Now, Officer Murphy, about that paint residue test you didn't think was necessary." The officer stumbled through his answer, clearly rattled by what he had just witnessed. The dynamic in the courtroom had shifted completely. Where before there had been condescension and dismissal, now there was respect and more than a little fear. "Officer Murphy," Jayden continued, his voice carrying new authority, "according to your report, you observed my client at 9:47 p.m., but I have here the security footage from a metro bus stop 3 blocks away, time-stamped at 9:45 p.m., clearly showing Marcus Williams waiting for the number 32 bus." He approached the evidence table and activated a laptop, the screen filled with grainy but unmistakable footage of Marcus Williams standing at a bus stop, checking his phone. The number 32 bus runs every 12 minutes during evening hours. According to Metro's own schedule, which I submitted as Defense Exhibit A, the bus that Marcus was waiting for arrived at 9:49 p.m. The route from that stop to the federal building takes exactly 4 minutes. Jayden walked closer to the jury box, his movements fluid and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe that Marcus Williams spray-painted the federal building at 9:47 p.m., but their own witness places him 3 blocks away at 9:45 p.m., waiting for a bus that didn't arrive until 9:49 p.m. D.A. Hartwell rose to object, but Jayden continued smoothly. "Furthermore, the prosecution's own forensic expert testified that the graffiti in question would have taken a minimum of 6 minutes to complete, based on complexity and size of the artwork. Even if Marcus had somehow teleported from the bus stop to the federal building the moment the bus arrived, he would have needed until 9:55 p.m. to complete the vandalism that Officer Murphy claims to have witnessed at 9:47 p.m. The jury was following every word now. Several members were taking notes. The mathematical impossibility of the prosecution's timeline was becoming crystal clear. "Your Honor," Jayden continued, his command of the courtroom now absolute, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to the body camera footage from Officer Murphy's arrest of my client." He pressed play on a laptop, and the courtroom watched as the events of that March evening unfolded on screen. The footage showed Marcus Williams standing near the federal building, clearly disoriented and confused, when Officer Murphy approached with his hand already on his weapon. "Officer Murphy," Jayden said, pausing the video, "in your report, you stated that my client resisted arrest aggressively and attempted to flee the scene. Is that your testimony?" "Yes, sir." He was being combative and uncooperative. "Let's watch the footage together, shall we?" The video resumed. Marcus's voice came through clearly. "What did I do? Sir, what did I do? I was just waiting for my bus. Please tell me what I did wrong." The teenager's voice cracked with fear and confusion. He made no aggressive moves, raised no hand in violence. When Officer Murphy grabbed his arm roughly, Marcus instinctively pulled back, a natural human response to unexpected physical contact. "This is what you call aggressive resistance, Officer Murphy?" Jayden's voice carried genuine incredulity. A 17-year-old boy asking for an explanation? The jury watched in uncomfortable silence as the video continued. Marcus complied with every command, even as his voice broke with fear. "Yes, sir. No, sir. I understand, sir." The picture of a terrified child, not a dangerous criminal. Judge Brennan cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Counselor, please stick to the relevant facts." "The relevant facts, Your Honor?" Jayden turned to face the bench directly. "The relevant facts are that a black teenager was arrested for a crime the timeline proves he couldn't have committed, charged with resistance he clearly didn't commit based on evidence that was never collected." His voice rose slightly, carrying genuine passion. The relevant facts are that we're here today because assumptions were made about my client based on his age, his race, and his presence in the wrong place at what the prosecution claims was the wrong time, except their own evidence proves it was impossible for him to be there. DA Hartwell shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is inflammatory and irrelevant. What's inflammatory? Jayden shot back, his voice carrying the full weight of his conviction. Is arresting a child for a crime he mathematically couldn't have committed and then claiming he resisted when the video shows him complying with every command while asking for an explanation. The courtroom was electric, with tension. Judge Brennan banged his gavel repeatedly. That's enough. Both counselors approached the bench. But Jayden wasn't finished. He looked directly at the judge, his voice steady and clear, carrying the authority of centuries of legal tradition. Asterisk fiat justitiarit caelum. Asterisk. The Latin phrase hung in the air like a challenge, like a prayer, like a promise. At the bench, Judge Brennan's face was red with anger. You think you're clever, don't you, counselor? I think I'm right, Your Honor. Watch your tone with me. Jayden met his gaze without flinching. Your Honor, with all due respect, I graduated first in my class at Harvard Law School. I speak 5 languages fluently. I've spent the last 6 months memorizing every relevant case precedent from the past 50 years. My tone is the least of your concerns right now. The judge stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Finally, he spoke quietly. Step back, counselor. Jayden returned to his position before the jury. When he spoke again, his voice carried both the authority of his education and the soul of his heritage. Asterisk fiat justitiarit caelum asterisk, he repeated. Let justice be done though the heavens fall. These words were spoken by Lord Mansfield in 1772 when he ruled that slavery could not exist under English common law, freeing James Somerset and setting a precedent that would echo through history. He walked slowly along the jury box, making eye contact with each member. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, justice requires us to look beyond our assumptions, beyond our comfort zones, beyond what we think we know about people based on how they look or sound or where they come from. The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on every word. The prosecution has given you assumptions. They've asked you to believe that a 17-year-old boy committed a crime that the laws of physics make impossible. They've asked you to ignore video evidence that contradicts their narrative. They've asked you to convict based on the color of the skin rather than the content of the evidence. Jayden's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But evidence doesn't lie. Mathematics doesn't discriminate. And justice, real justice, doesn't care about anyone's assumptions or prejudices. It only cares about truth. He returned to the defense table, placing his hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus Williams is not guilty because he couldn't be guilty. The timeline doesn't work. The evidence doesn't exist. The resistance never happened. And if we convict him anyway, we're not dispensing justice. We're perpetuating injustice. The jury sat in rapt attention, several members visibly moved by his words. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to trust the evidence. Trust the timeline. Trust the video. Trust the law. Because when we do that, when we actually follow the evidence where it leads, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. He paused, letting his final words settle over the courtroom like a benediction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution has given you assumptions and asked you to call them facts. I've given you actual facts and asked you to call them what they are. Proof of innocence. The choice is yours, but the truth is clear. The jury deliberated for 37 minutes. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were solemn but determined. The foreman, a middle-aged black woman who had watched every moment of the trial with intense focus, stood to deliver their verdict. We find defendant Marcus Williams not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers, gasps, and scattered applause. Marcus collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed by relief and disbelief. His mother rushed forward from the gallery, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her son. Thank you, Marcus whispered to Jayden, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for seeing me. Judge Brennan banged his gavel mechanically, his movements robotic and distant. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom began to empty, spectators clustering around Marcus and his family to offer congratulations, the judge's voice cut through the celebration. Mr. Carter, my chambers. Now. Jayden followed him into the oak-paneled office behind the courtroom. Judge Brennan closed the door firmly, then turned to face him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. 23 years on this bench, the judge finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. 23 years, and I've never been educated quite so thoroughly in my own courtroom. Jayden stood silently, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I made assumptions about you from the moment you walked into my courtroom," Brennan continued, moving to the window that overlooked the D.C. skyline. "Your accent, your age, your background. I decided you were unprepared, unprofessional, unworthy of respect." He turned back to face Jayden, and for the first time, his expression held something like humility. "Harvard Law, summa cum laude, first in your class, 5 languages." The judge shook his head slowly. "You could practice anywhere in this country. Corporate law, constitutional law, Supreme Court advocacy. Why public defense? Why cases like this?" Jayden considered his answer carefully. "Because Marcus Williams deserves the same quality of representation as anyone else, Your Honor. Because justice shouldn't depend on how much money you have or how you sound when you speak. Even after what I put you through today. Especially after what you put me through today. Because if it can happen to me, with my degrees and my credentials, imagine what happens to defendants who don't have those advantages." Judge Brennan nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You made your point today, counselor, in more ways than one." He moved to his desk and sat down heavily. "I want you to know that I'll be recommending a formal review of Officer Murphy's arrest procedures, and I'll be requesting additional training for court personnel on cultural sensitivity. That's appreciated, Your Honor, but it's not enough." The judge looked up sharply. "Excuse me? With respect, Your Honor, this isn't about sensitivity training. It's about fundamental respect for the presumption of innocence and the rights of all defendants, regardless of what they look like or how they sound." Jayden's voice carried quiet authority. Marcus Williams almost went to prison today for a crime he didn't commit, not because the evidence was compelling, but because assumptions were made about him before he ever entered this courtroom. That's not a sensitivity issue, that's a justice issue. The judge studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "I won't forget this, counselor, and I hope you won't let this experience discourage you from practicing in federal court." Jayden shook his hand firmly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, it would take a lot more than this to discourage me from anywhere I belong." The walk from the judge's chambers to the courthouse steps felt like a journey between worlds. Behind him lay the formal dignity of federal justice, with its marble columns and hushed reverence for tradition. Ahead waited the real world, where justice was messier, harder won, and infinitely more precious. The late afternoon sun painted the courthouse steps in golden light, as Jayden emerged to find a crowd of reporters waiting. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, voices calling out questions from every direction. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to embarrass a federal judge in his own courtroom? What was your strategy going into today's trial? Will you be filing a formal complaint against Judge Brennan? How do you respond to critics who say you played the race card?" Jayden raised his hand, and the crowd quieted. When he spoke, his voice carried both the dignity of his education and the strength of his heritage, no longer code-switching between different versions of himself, but fully integrated, fully present. "Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't embarrass anyone today. The law spoke for itself. Justice spoke for itself. Sometimes that's uncomfortable, but it's always necessary." He paused, looking out over a crowd of reporters, many of whom were seeing him clearly for the first time. Marcus Williams is free today not because of any strategy or theatrics, but because the evidence demanded his freedom. That's how the system is supposed to work. That's how it should work every time. A reporter called out, "But what about the judge's comments about your accent, your background?" Jayden's smile was small but genuine. "My accent is part of who I am. My background is part of who I am. My education is part of who I am. None of those things should determine whether justice is served, but all of them inform how I serve justice." He began walking down the steps, the crowd following. "I'm proud of where I come from, proud of how I sound, and proud of what I've accomplished. But I'm most proud that today, a 17-year-old boy gets to go home to his family instead of to prison for a crime he didn't commit." At the bottom of the courthouse steps, a familiar figure waited beside an old sedan. Dorothy Carter had driven up from Atlanta that morning, wearing her best dress and clutching her father's worn Bible, the same book that had taught Jayden his first Latin phrases when he was 7 years old. "How'd it go, baby?" she asked, though his expression had already given her the answer. "We won, Mama," he said, embracing her warmly. "We won big." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears and pride. "I heard some of it on the courthouse feed. That Latin you spoke, that was your granddaddy's teaching right there. Every word of it." He took the Bible from her hands, feeling its familiar weight. "He always said the truth would set me free. Today it set Marcus free, too. As they walked to the car, reporters still calling questions behind them, Dorothy squeezed her son's arm. "They heard your accent today, didn't they?" Jayden's smile was warm and satisfied. "They heard my accent, Mama. Now they'll remember my name." The drive back to Atlanta would take 5 hours, plenty of time to decompress from the day's events. As they pulled away from the courthouse, Jayden caught his reflection in the passenger side mirror. The same face that had been underestimated his entire life looked back at him. The same accent that had been mocked and dismissed still carried his words. But something fundamental had changed. Today, for the first time in his career, those things hadn't been obstacles to overcome. They had been strengths to embrace. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Job offers from prestigious firms. Interview requests from national news networks. Speaking engagement opportunities that would have seemed impossible just that morning. He silenced the phone and tucked it away. Tomorrow, he had 3 more clients who needed someone who understood that justice wasn't about how you sounded. It was about how clearly you could make the truth heard. Asterisk fiat justitiarit caelum asterisk, he murmured, watching the D.C. skyline disappear in the rearview mirror. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. And in a federal courtroom that afternoon, surrounded by centuries of legal tradition and the weight of institutional power, justice had indeed been done, not despite his accent, his background, or his appearance, but through the strength that came from embracing all of those things while demanding that the law live up to its highest ideals. The heavens hadn't fallen. They had simply made room for one more voice in the chorus of justice, a voice that spoke with the authority of Harvard Law and the soul of Atlanta, Georgia, proving that truth and justice had no accent, no color, no background. They simply were. And today, they had been enough.